As promised, we are going to be taking a longer and more detailed look at the Essex class, albeit this is somewhat delayed from the original Essex video. It's going to take a similar format to the extended series we did on the Queen Elizabeth class and the Iowa class, all done previously. Now, whilst with the Iowas we spent an entire video looking at their guns and other armament, an aircraft carrier is not defined by its guns, but rather by its aircraft, and so we're going to look at some of those today. We're going to look at each broad category of aircraft, operated roughly in chronological order, each time we look at a category. So this will help with references in future videos to particular carriers' careers, and I don't have to detail each and every single aircraft every time I'm talking about the various carriers. So with that in mind, obviously this in-depth look will take a similar format, as I said, to the Iowa class, so it will either form the main or the supplementary special video on Wednesdays, and be scattered out where appropriate and where the special video hasn't taken extraordinary amounts of time to prepare in and of itself. Today we're going to look at the fighters operated by the Essex class. So where else to start but the F4F Wildcat? Now, the Essex class would very briefly operate the F4F in early 1943, and we can verify this as footage of some Wildcats landing on Essex herself does exist. But this venerable warhorse of an aircraft was scheduled for replacement due in large part to not being able to tangle with the A6M0 in general combat. Although the Wildcat was superior in some aspects, in a carrier war, when a fighter's primary role is protecting strike aircraft or breaking up incoming attacks, you couldn't always guarantee a scenario where the aircraft could play to its strengths. You just had to go with what the circumstances handed you. And so, as a result, the F4F's days on fleet carriers were numbered. And although a variant would go on to see service aboard escort carriers and the like, it would soon be replaced in service aboard the Essex class by the F6F Hellcat. This would be the preeminent United States Navy carrier fighter for the majority of the US's involvement in World War II, and it came into service with two primary advantages in its main operational theatre. Its radically increased performance, in part designed specifically in response to combat reports that detailed encounters between Wildcats and Zeros, and also thanks to the Wildcats' efforts, alongside the rest of the USN, the bulk of the Imperial Japanese Navy's pre-war experienced pilot corps had been somewhat broken and shot down at the Battle of Midway, which meant that a superior new fighter in the form of the F6F would also face a gradual degradation of enemy combat pilot effectiveness that would only get worse as the war went on, culminating in incidents like the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot and the horrific casualties sustained by the kamikaze attacks, which often arrived in vastly greater numbers, but did far less damage than earlier, smaller aerial assaults by the Japanese Navy pilots. After some time confined to land-based operations, once the Royal Navy had worked out how to use it aboard a ship, the Hellcat would be supplemented by the next aircraft we'll look at, the F4U Corsair. Now, the Corsair was actually a higher performance aircraft than the Hellcat, but early issues with some of its more advanced design features and a few visibility problems would see it restricted to Marine Corps use from island bases until the Royal Navy, which was operating Corsairs from their carriers, made a number of changes both to the aircraft's approach path on landing and to its overall design, altering the cockpit and clipping the wings, amongst other minor changes, which significantly reduced the issues that were involved with operating it from a carrier. So by the end of the war, the Corsair was operating alongside the Hellcat on most United States Navy carriers. Whilst the Corsair would continue in service as late as the Korean War in a fighter-bomber role, the Hellcat itself would be replaced at the end of the war by the next aircraft, the F8F Bearcat. The Bearcat can best be summed up as taking the Hellcat's engine and then wrapping the lightest possible airframe around it to create an incredibly high-performance, lightweight fighter that could be used across the fleet, as opposed to the Hellcat, whose higher weight had restricted it to fleet carrier operations. Unfortunately for the Bearcat, as with so many other late 1940s piston-engine aircraft that had awesome performance compared to their predecessors, the debut of the early jets had already put the writing on the wall, and after a short production run, this aircraft would find themselves retired in favour of jet-powered fighters such as the F2H Banshee. The Bearcat had come with an optional armament loadout of either 50 caliber machine guns or cannons, as the US aerial forces in general were somewhat slower than other nations in the take-up of cannon as a replacement for machine gun armament. But the Banshee came as stock with 420mm cannon and would initially operate in the Korean War, first as an escort and then later as a ground attack aircraft. Its somewhat limited performance compared to the latest Soviet aircraft was mitigated by mostly operating beyond the Russian fighters' effective range, which would mean they wouldn't see any air-to-air victories, but also no air-to-air losses, and virtually no losses at all in combat, except for a handful of casualties to ground fire. It would also perform vital high-altitude photo recon missions and all-weather fleet defense, but it was largely overshadowed in service by the F9F Panther and its successor, the Cougar. Like the Banshee, the Panther, which would be the United States Navy's primary fighter aircraft in the Korean War, would roll into action with 420mm cannon as its main armament. In keeping with developments in the late 1940s and early 1950s, which began to see roles merging, the aircraft could also carry a wide array of rockets and bombs, making it a fighter bomber in a somewhat similar vein to the Corsair. However, the straight-wing Panther, somewhat reminiscent of the Gloucester Meteor half a decade earlier, was a bit slow and was replaced by a modified version, the Cougar, which had swept wings. These offered performance improvements, but the development cycle meant it would miss the Korean War, and in turn, the Cougar would be rapidly outpaced by advancing technology. In their initial introduction into service, however, the F9Fs had, in fact, beaten out the FJ-1 Fury. This aircraft was to be the first operational United States Navy jet fighter, but performance limitations meant that only 30 production models would see service, mostly aboard the USS Boxer, as the aircraft would lose out in competition to the F9F, its technical successor being misleadingly named the FJ2-3-4 Fury. Although these aircraft shared a name and the sequential numerical designations suggesting they were all the same, this was in fact a completely different aircraft, as is rather obvious in the pictures. It was in fact a naval version of the F-86 Sabre, brought in as something of an emergency interim measure to counter MiG-15s, whilst the Cougar and other aircraft were being developed. Although demand for the basic F-86 meant that the FJ-2 would not see operational service until well after the Korean War. It would vanish quickly due to a number of operational problems, in favour mainly of the FJ-3, which was a re-engined FJ-2 that used a British turbojet that had substantially more thrust, although this was not without its own issues. The aircraft would see a lot more service than the FJ-2, but in turn would be superseded by the FJ-4, which took the basic fuselage and engine of the FJ-3 and gave it a completely new wing, increasing performance again. All of this development would take place over a few years, and the time from the first FJ-2 entering service to the last FJ-4 being shuffled off into reserve units was less than a decade. Its somewhat interim status, meaning that it would be succeeded relatively quickly by the F9F Cougar, and perhaps more questionably by the F7U Cutlass, with underpowered engines and a long list of technical and aerodynamic faults. The so-called gutless Cutlass would attract a variety of derogatory nicknames almost as fast as examples crashed into the ocean. With a quarter of production examples ending up destroyed in accidents, it would also become known as the Ensign Eliminator, which was about the most polite name that I could find for it. And it would be actually kicked off at least two Essex-class carriers entirely, the Hancock and Ticonderoga, after severe accidents. Being replaced in the short term by more F9F Cougars, the next generation of fighters aboard the Essex class would be the F8U Crusader. This was a huge step change in fighter capability for the United States Navy, entering service alongside the F4 Phantom II. which was not able to operate from the Essex class as it was far too large and far too heavy. The F8U, also called the last of the gunfighters, would be the primary fighter power of most of the Essex class that was still in service in carrier roles until the ship's eventual retirement. This aircraft was fast, agile, and with plenty of room for upgrades over the years, including the capacity to use a variety of air-to-air missiles, including the only radar-guided version of the AIM-9 Sidewinder. They would be the first American aircraft to engage in aerial combat above Vietnam, launched from the Essex-class USS Hancock, which features quite prominently in the development of jet fighters in the United States Navy. They would prove invaluable, especially early in the war when the less agile missile trucks that were supposed to be the next generation of fighter design began to suffer at the hand of the agile MiG-17s of the Vietnamese Air Force, but which the Crusader was quite happily able to handle. Now, this covers all the major fighter types operated from the Essex class, but 3 other types built in relatively small numbers and all introduced into brief service starting in 1956 also require mentioning, as they did operate in various squadrons from the Essex class as well. Starting with the F11F Tiger. This was a competitor to the F8U Crusader and would see a short operational life due to being outperformed by the latter aircraft, with its primary claim to fame being that it was the first jet fighter that managed to shoot itself down, as a pilot was testing his guns in a shallow dive, then entered a steeper dive, and managed to overtake his own cannon rounds, which began to fall under gravity, and met up with the aircraft again at a lower altitude. The other aircraft in this somewhat smaller field of operations included the F3H Demon. This was a fairly fast and well-designed aircraft that had a lot of potential on paper, but was unfortunately hampered by a complete failure of the engine that it was designed for to deliver on the needed power, and retrofitting the best engine they could find that was vaguely in the same size and weight class still left it dramatically short on the power that it had been designed to exploit. But the aircraft is notable in that the various attempts to upgrade it to fix the various issues it was left with would lead directly to the development of the F4 Phantom II, which of course went on to be fairly legendary. And that leaves us with the F4D Skyray, partially designed by Ed Heinemann, who would go on to design the legendary A4 Skyhawk. The Skyray was actually quite popular with its pilots, but was designed almost entirely around high-altitude interception, which would leave it at a disadvantage when newer multi-role aircraft came along, and the aircraft itself proved fairly unsuited for retrofitting to other missions, leading to a fairly short operational career. So, that's a pocket history of all the fighter aircraft that were deployed operationally aboard Essex-class carriers. We'll take a look at their strike aircraft next time as we revisit the class before moving on to the many and varied refit standards and then the histories of various specific ships over the next few months.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.